The soft hum of air conditioning clashed with the heavy scent of old oil paint and polished marble. Afternoon light streamed through tall, arched windows of the Whitmore Gallery, catching the edges of gold leaf frames and gliding over canvases that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. Naomi Carter stood at the entrance for a beat longer than necessary, adjusting the strap of her leather bag across her shoulder, her fingers grazing the worn edges of a notebook she'd carried since grad school. Her dark curls framed a thoughtful face. She wore a simple cream blouse tucked into tailored slacks. Understated elegance, she'd thought. Safe. But from the moment she stepped through the threshold, Naomi could feel it. The shift in temperature wasn't just the air. It was in the eyes that flicked her way and lingered a second too long. In the subtle tightening of jaws, the abrupt silences in conversation. Something invisible, yet unmistakably sharp. She approached the welcome desk with a smile that cost her more energy than it should have. "Hi, I'm here for the Harlem Renaissance exhibit. I saw it listed online as open to the public today." The young man behind the counter, early 20s, tousled hair, pale skin that turned instantly red, looked flustered. He tapped nervously at the tablet in front of him. One moment. "Ma'am, I think there's been a change. The exhibit might actually be part of a private viewing this afternoon." Naomi arched an eyebrow, patient but firm. "Well, it didn't say that online. I'm an art historian. I flew in from Boston just to see this collection." That's when the heels clicked. Sharp, precise, like judgment in motion. Claire Montgomery descended the mezzanine staircase in a navy blue sheath dress and pearl earrings. Everything about her seemed deliberately curated, from the icy blonde hair to the clipboard tucked neatly under one arm. Her eyes scanned Naomi with the trained efficiency of someone who'd made a career of deciding who belonged and who did. "Not! Excuse me," Claire interjected, stepping between Naomi and the desk. "This section of the gallery is closed to the public today. You must have missed the signage." Naomi turned slowly. "There was no signage, and your website still lists the exhibit as open." Claire's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Even so, this is a curated event for collectors and donors. It's exclusive. I'm not here to drink champagne. I came for the art. I've published 2 papers on Richmond Barthay and Augusta Savage." "Good for you," Claire interrupted. "But I'm afraid we can't allow just anyone to walk in off the street." Naomi's breath caught, as if the words had slapped her. "Off the street?" Claire tilted her head, mock sympathy glistening in her voice. "You understand? Don't? You? These events are delicate. Some pieces haven't been shown in over 70 years. Security is tight. It's just not the right time." Naomi stood taller, anger threading through her voice. "And what exactly do you think I came here to do?" Claire gave a brittle laugh. "I don't know, but you're making quite the scene." That's when the murmurs started. Soft at first, like the rustling of fabric. 2 older patrons whispered behind cupped hands. A suited man near the far wall gave Naomi a side glance, then leaned over to whisper something to a woman in a diamond choker, who promptly narrowed her eyes in Naomi's direction. One of the docents, young, white, visibly uncomfortable, hovered at a distance, unsure whether to step in or disappear. "Ma'am," Claire continued, "if you don't leave now, I'll have to call security." Naomi's voice cracked, not from weakness, but from disbelief. "You're calling security on me for being interested in my own people's history?" Claire's smile evaporated. "I'm calling security," she said slowly, "because you're refusing to follow gallery policy." Then came the final humiliation. A uniformed guard appeared from the corridor. Broad-shouldered, silent, looking at Naomi as if she were a threat to be neutralized rather than a guest to be protected. His walk was measured, professional, but his presence said enough. The room felt colder now. Naomi's hands trembled as she tightened them into fists. She wanted to shout, to fight, but more than that, she didn't want to give them what they were clearly waiting for: the angry black woman spectacle. She swallowed hard and stepped back, her voice low and controlled. "You have no idea who you just pushed out." Claire crossed her arms. "I'm quite confident I do." But she didn't. No one in the room did. From a far corner of the gallery, behind a glass case of rare photographs, a tall man in a tailored gray suit stood watching. His silver hair was slicked back, his dark eyes unreadable, and his hands were locked behind his back like a man both in command and under siege. No one noticed him. He preferred it that way. For years, Jonathan Whitmore had lived among shadows of frames and legacies, his name on plaques, his presence behind curtains. But now, those curtains were burning. His heart pounded as he watched. The young woman walked toward the exit with her chin high, shame simmering beneath dignity. He'd seen her laugh in grainy videos from her college lectures, seen her cry in the back row of Angela's funeral, never knowing he stood in the far aisle, hidden by dark glasses. And now she was here, being dragged out of the one place that should have welcomed her. Jonathan stepped forward. A quiet fell over the room, as if someone had pressed pause on reality. Claire turned toward him, paling. "Mr. Whitmore, sir, I didn't realize you were—" Jonathan raised one hand. Silence. He walked slowly to the center of the room, past priceless sculptures and hushed stares, until he reached Naomi's side. He looked around at the crowd, at the collectors and curators, the old families of Charleston, the polished racists in silk suits and soft prejudice. Then he said it, loud, clear, measured. "This woman that you just escorted out is my daughter." And then the world cracked open. For a moment after Jonathan's words echoed through the gallery, no one moved. Time fractured. Naomi felt the silence crash down harder than the embarrassment ever had. She stared at the man beside her, elegant, composed, cold as granite. And the word daughter spun in her mind like a foreign object that refused to land. She didn't speak, couldn't. Her throat constricted. Claire stepped back, color draining from her face as whispers erupted like wildfire. Is he serious? Daughter? Jonathan Whitmore? That girl? Jonathan's expression didn't waver. His gaze was fixed ahead, scanning the room with the same severity he might use on a failed acquisition. He was claiming her like an artifact, publicly, deliberately, as if possession equaled apology. Naomi turned toward him, her voice barely audible. "What did you just say?" He didn't look at her. "You heard me." The next morning, the news had already broken. Whitmore heiress revealed after gallery incident. Billionaire collector acknowledges secret daughter during public confrontation. Was Naomi Carter hidden from the art world, or hidden by it? Her inbox was full. Journalists, former classmates, colleagues from her university. Her phone buzzed every minute. Some messages were sympathetic. Most were invasive. One even asked how it felt to be Charleston's Meghan Markle. Naomi stood in her hotel room, still half-dressed, scrolling without seeing. The television in the background played footage of the incident on loop, her face frozen mid-turn, Jonathan standing beside her like a statue sculpted for drama. She turned off the TV. The knock at the door didn't surprise her. She didn't even look through the peephole. She opened it to find him there. Jonathan Whitmore. No security. No assistant. Just a man in a tailored coat holding his hat in both hands. "May I come in?" She stared at him. "You think I owe you that much?" "No," he said. "I don't think you owe me anything." She held the door open. Barely. He stepped in and looked around the modest hotel suite with a strange curiosity, as if trying to understand the small life he'd helped create from a very large distance. Naomi didn't sit. She crossed her arms, standing by the window. "Let's skip the dramatic reunion. Start talking." Jonathan nodded slowly, removing his coat. He didn't attempt sentimentality. Just truth. "I met your mother in 1996. She was luminous, brilliant, furious in the best way. She was protesting the closure of a black cultural center in Savannah. I was donating a mural to the same university. Our paths crossed, and she challenged everything I thought I believed." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "But not enough to keep you from leaving her." "I didn't leave her," he said, then corrected himself. "Not willingly. My family, my world, had rules. I was expected to marry into a legacy, to protect the name. I was young, cowardly. I convinced myself walking away was protecting her." "And me?" He didn't answer immediately. "I didn't know you existed until Angela contacted me a year after she gave birth. By then, I was already married. Already tied down by a life I didn't respect, but couldn't escape." Naomi felt her chest tighten. "So you paid her off." His eyes met hers. "I supported you anonymously. Tuition, books, a few grants that had my name hidden behind foundations. I wanted to give you something without taking anything. But not a father." "No," he said quietly. "Not a father." They stood in silence for a moment. Naomi's anger warred with the sadness rising in her throat. This wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't even closure. It was just ugly truth laid bare. "So why now?" she asked. "Why claim me in front of all Charleston? What changed?" Jonathan looked her dead in the eye. "Because watching them treat you like that, like you didn't belong in that room, was the last straw. They've done it to others. They did it to your mother. And I let it happen. I won't let them erase you too." The following week passed in a blur of interviews, press conferences, and sudden fame Naomi never asked for. The gallery issued a formal apology. Claire Montgomery was placed on administrative leave, and the board invited Naomi to return as a consultant on African American art initiatives. She declined, politely at first. Then, on a quiet Thursday morning, she returned to the gallery alone. The exhibit was still up, the Harlem Renaissance, in Southern perspective. Rare pieces, many on loan, some from the Whitmore private collection. She wandered the room slowly, letting the silence settle around her, until she reached a sculpture tucked into a corner. A slender bronze figure of a woman in motion, arms open, eyes lifted skyward. The plaque read, "Untitled, circa 1997, attributed to G. Ellis." Naomi froze. She knew that curve, that lift of the spine, that balance of tension and grace. She'd seen it before, in a dusty box in her mother's attic. Sketches, studies, phrases in Angela's looping handwriting. She remembered her mother's fingers, stained with clay and charcoal, always moving. Naomi took a step back. She moved through the gallery, scanning other pieces. A collage signed by M.E. Johnston. A textile labeled Anonymous Early 2000s. But the style, the technique, It screamed Angela. Naomi's heart pounded. Was it possible? Had her mother's work been taken? Hidden under other names? Sold without credit? And then it hit her. Jonathan hadn't recognized it. Or worse, he had. Naomi sat cross-legged on the floor of her apartment, surrounded by photos, notes, and a small mountain of her mother's old sketchbooks. For the third night in a row, she barely slept. She couldn't. The sculpture at the gallery haunted her. The stance, the brushwork in a nearby painting, the patchwork patterns in the textile titled Anonymous. Every piece had Angela's fingerprint. Not literally, but spiritually. There was a rhythm to her mother's work, a precision shaped by struggle, joy, protest, and grace. Naomi recognized it in her bones, and yet not a single item bore her mother's name. She opened a folder labeled Spring 1999, full of letters Angela never mailed. Most were addressed to herself, or to a future version of Naomi. One, in particular, stopped her breath. I've been told they want to include my sculpture in a curated collection, but under a collective name. Anonymous submission. They say it'll sell better that way. That no one wants to buy work from a single black woman no one's heard of. I want to scream, but I need the money for Naomi's school clothes. God help me. I signed the damn paper. Naomi's hands trembled. Her mother had been erased, bought out, then forgotten. Not by accident, by design. She returned to the gallery 2 days later, this time with purpose. The gallery director, Richard Sterling, greeted her in a shallow way that always reminded her of theater. He wore tortoiseshell glasses and smiled as if nothing scandalous had ever happened under his watch. Naomi, always a pleasure. I heard you're considering a return in an advisory role. I'm not here for a job, she said. I need access to your archives. Sterling blinked. I beg your pardon? I want to see the acquisition records for the Harlem Renaissance exhibit, especially the works listed as anonymous or attributed to G. Ellis or M.E. Johnston. He adjusted his glasses. Those are internal files, not available to the public. I'm afraid I'm not the public anymore. His smile faltered. I'm Jonathan Whitmore's daughter. That makes me part of this institution. So either you let me look at those files, or I'll have a journalist do it after publishing the story I'm writing about the gallery's appropriation of black artists. There was no mistaking the steel in her tone. An hour later, she sat in the back office of the archives, flipping through a ledger yellowed with time and betrayal. It didn't take long. Untitled sculpture. Donor, M.E. Johnston. Acquisition price, gifted under collective program. A second entry, 2002. Textile collage. Donor, Claire Montgomery, via estate sale. Provenance, unknown, and then it clicked. Claire. She hadn't just harassed Naomi at the door. She was personally involved in acquiring at least one piece, Angela's piece. Naomi remembered a story her mother once told her about a white neighbor who'd bought 2 of Angela's early works for next to nothing when she couldn't afford rent. Naomi slammed the ledger shut. She waited until the board meeting to confront them. Jonathan had asked her to attend. He was stepping back from day-to-day involvement at the gallery and wanted Naomi to be seen as a bridge between the future and the past. But Naomi had a different plan. As the board gathered in the ornate conference room, a room adorned with Whitmore, family portraits and curated self-congratulations, Naomi stood near the head of the table, her laptop open, her voice calm. I want to talk to you about theft. Richard Sterling shifted. Claire Montgomery stiffened. Naomi clicked a button. A photo of the untitled bronze sculpture appeared on the screen. Then beside it, a page from Angela Carter's sketchbook. Same pose, same detail. This sculpture was signed G. Ellis, but I have proof my mother created it. In 1997, I have the original drawings, dated and annotated. Another click, the textile image, another matching sketch. She sold it to a neighbor to pay rent. That neighbor was Claire's mother. Claire's eyes widened. I'm not finished. Naomi stepped closer to the board. My mother wasn't just an artist. She was a survivor. And you've built a collection on the backs of people like her, black artists whose names were erased to make the work more palatable to rich collectors. Jonathan leaned forward, troubled. Naomi, are you saying? I'm saying your gallery is a monument to curated injustice. Maybe you didn't know, but now you do. Sterling cleared his throat. This is a complicated situation, Naomi. No, it's simple. You either acknowledge these works as my mother's and credit her retroactively, or I go to every journalist who's been hounding me for a week. The board fell into stunned silence. Jonathan looked around the table. Well, he asked, voice low, what's it going to be? Later that day, Naomi stood alone in the sculpture room. The label beneath Untitled had been changed. Angela Carter, 1997. Donated without attribution. Verified 2025. She stared at it, tears brimming, throat burning. Not from sadness, from justice. You'd have hated the spotlight, she whispered, but you earned every damn minute of it. Behind her, Jonathan approached quietly. I didn't know, he said. Not about the pieces. Naomi didn't turn. I believe you, she said, but you were still part of the system that let it happen. I know. They stood in silence. She gave up her name for my education, Naomi said, voice soft. She let them erase her so I could have a future. I wish I'd known. She wouldn't have wanted you to know, Jonathan replied. She wanted you to rise on your own merit. That was her strength. Naomi finally turned to him. So now what? You could take over the gallery, he said. Rebuild it. Recenter it. Naomi nodded slowly. Maybe. But I won't inherit your guilt. He gave a small, sad smile. Good. The emails flooded in before dawn. A brilliant reclamation. Angela Carter, the unsung sculptor of the Harlem Revival, the woman behind the bronze, and the daughter who brought her name back. The headlines had shifted. They no longer called Naomi the secret Whitmore heiress. They called her a curator of justice, an art historian turned activist, the daughter of a silenced genius. Suddenly, she wasn't the scandal. She was the reckoning. Still, the weight of it all pressed on her chest in quiet hours. Every day, she waded through emails from descendants of other erased artists. Some were angry, some were grateful. All were unfinished stories. She returned to Boston for a brief lecture at the university, only to find the auditorium over capacity. Her students didn't just want to learn about the Harlem Renaissance anymore. They wanted to know how to fight for memory, how to honor what history tried to hide. Naomi stood at the podium, clearing her throat as she pulled up a photograph of Angela in her 30s, laughing in the sun, her hands stained with clay. She wasn't famous, Naomi said, voice steady. She wasn't even known. But the work she left behind spoke louder than the silence she endured. My job now is to make sure none of you forget her again. Meanwhile, back in Charleston, Jonathan Whitmore faced his own kind of reckoning. He stepped down from daily operations at the gallery, issuing a statement that managed to sound both noble and uncomfortable. In recognizing the failures of our institution's past, I believe it is time for a new chapter, one led by voices we failed to hear for too long. The board installed an interim director, but all eyes remained on Naomi. Rumors swirled. Would she accept the permanent role? Would she dismantle the Whitmore name entirely? Claire Montgomery officially resigned. Her mother's estate sale, which had quietly moved Angela's textile years ago, became a subject of legal review. Naomi didn't press charges, but she did request a public statement acknowledging the origin of the work. "I want them to admit it," Naomi told Jonathan. "Not just to me, to the world." He agreed. And for the first time, she believed he meant it. In a quiet corner of the gallery, Naomi worked with a small team of interns to curate a new exhibit, The Echoed Lineage. It focused on Black artists whose works had been unsigned, misattributed, or lost in the margins of white-owned archives. For every piece on the wall, there was a story: a daughter's discovery, a grandson's memory, a single journal entry that turned myth into proof. Jonathan visited during off hours, not to interfere, just to witness. "You've transformed the space," he said one evening, his voice softer than she was used to. Naomi turned, dust on her fingertips. "No, I just pulled back the velvet curtain." He looked around. "It's better this way." She paused before responding. "You once told me you watched me grow up from a distance," she said, almost too softly. "But that's the problem, isn't it? Watching and doing are not the same thing." Jonathan didn't argue. He simply nodded. "I know," he said. "I'll carry that, whether you forgive me or not." 3 weeks later, Naomi stood in front of the newly installed sculpture, her mother's untitled piece, now titled by Naomi herself. Unyielding, she'd placed it at the entrance to the gallery. Visitors would no longer enter through the lens of curated whiteness. They would pass through Angela first, through the hands of a woman who had once sculpted in silence. A small plaque beneath. The pedestal read, "Angela Carter, 1968-2018. Mother, artist, activist. Lost, but not forgotten." A little girl stopped beside the sculpture, her eyes wide. "Mom," she whispered. "She looks like she's flying." Naomi watched the scene quietly from behind a column. And for the first time in weeks, a smile broke across her face. Full, unguarded. She wasn't flying yet, but the ground beneath her was finally steady. Jonathan reached out less often now, respectfully. He sent books sometimes, on sculpture, on art restitution, on women erased by history. He never asked for a title or a role. He simply waited, unsure whether he was still part of her story or just an artifact of its beginning. Naomi responded when she could. Never cruel, but never close. Forgiveness wasn't a moment. It was a process. And she wasn't ready yet. But one afternoon, while cataloging donated sketchbooks, Naomi opened a padded envelope and froze. Inside was a charcoal portrait of her, drawn from a photo she hadn't known existed. Her, age 6, on a swing set. The back of the paper had a handwritten note. "She had your eyes. I never forgot that." AC Naomi held the drawing to her chest. Then she picked up her phone and typed, "Jonathan, did you know about this drawing? It's signed by her. I think she wanted you to have it someday, but maybe she wanted me to find it first. Anyway, thank you for the books." She hit send. It was a start. The first time Naomi walked through the Whitmore Gallery with no one watching her, no one doubting her presence, and no one questioning why she was there. She didn't feel victorious. She felt responsible. The building hadn't changed much on the outside. Still the same whitewashed facade, the same grand columns meant to impress and intimidate. But inside, the air moved differently now. New names hung beneath old works. New artists stood beside historic ones. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was intentional, reflective. She had said no to the director title, but yes to something more powerful: curatorial authority and creative freedom. The board called it unprecedented. Naomi called it necessary. Twice a week, she hosted open sessions in the gallery atrium. No press, no ticketing, just chairs, dialogue, and art. She called them restorative hours, time for community members to bring forgotten names, unlabeled photos, even anonymous signatures on the backs of thrifted canvases. Sometimes they led nowhere. Sometimes they cracked something wide open. One afternoon, an older man named Harold Jenkins brought in a charcoal portrait he'd found in his grandmother's attic. The signature read, "LMC Naomi studied the stroke." The weight of the line. Then something flickered in her memory. She disappeared into the archives and returned with an old pamphlet. A 1964 community arts program from a small church in Columbia, South Carolina. Listed among the instructors was Lydia May Carter, Angela's aunt, Naomi's great-aunt. Naomi traced the ink on the signature and felt it, a connection that had slept in shadows for decades. "I think this belonged to your family," she told Harold. He blinked back tears. "I never knew my grandmother painted." Naomi smiled gently. "Now you do." In late May, on what would have been Angela's 57th birthday, the gallery unveiled its most important exhibition to date, The Hands That Built the Frame. It featured art from generations of Black Southern creators whose work had been sold under white names, misattributed, or simply buried. It wasn't just a celebration, it was a correction. Naomi wrote the opening essay for the exhibit catalog, "Art is not neutral. It remembers who lifted the brush and who was forced to let go." This collection is not only a tribute to what was lost, but a declaration of what will no longer be hidden. At the center of the gallery stood Unyielding, Angela's sculpture, and behind it, projected on the back wall, was a short film made by Naomi, blending interviews, letters, and fragments of her mother's voice. When the lights dimmed and the first chords of Angela's favorite Nina Simone song began to play, Naomi stood in the back row of the crowd, letting the weight of it wash over her. This time, she didn't cry. She stood still, straight, unyielding. Jonathan didn't attend the opening. Naomi hadn't invited him, and he hadn't asked. But 2 days later, a handwritten letter arrived at her office. Not an email, not a typed note, just ink and a slow, deliberate hand. "Naomi, I saw the coverage. I watched the footage, and I've never been more proud of anyone in my life. Your mother would have called it justice. I call it grace. I won't intrude on what you're building. But I'm here, if you ever want to share the silence. Always, Jonathan." She read the letter twice. Then she folded it, placed it in her desk, drawer, and left it there. Not as an end, but as a thread, one she could choose to pull on or not when the time was right. Summer arrived slowly in Charleston. The heat came first, then the blooms, jasmine and honeysuckle, sticky on the breeze. Naomi walked the gallery gardens barefoot one evening, her shoes in hand, the day's final tour long over. She stopped at a bench under a magnolia tree, the same one where her mother once sketched for hours without interruption. The memory wasn't hers. It had been described by one of Angela's oldest friends, a retired teacher named Miss Dolores, who came every week now. She'd talked to the statues, Dolores had said once, laughing, said they needed company. Naomi sat down and looked up at the sky. darkening to lavender. She thought of her mother, hands in clay, head tilted to the side, always chasing form in the formless. She thought of the girl who had walked into the gallery just months ago, only to be told she didn't belong. And then she thought of the woman she had become, not because Jonathan claimed her, but because Angela built her. No legacy could buy that. No bloodline could grant it. It was earned, sculpted, like every piece her mother ever made. Weeks later, a new installation went up. An empty frame on a bare white wall. No artist name, no plaque, just a simple sign beneath it. This space is reserved for what was lost. Bring us what you remember. We'll help the world remember it too. Every week, someone did. A quilt fragment, a sketch, a poem, a photo of a woman standing next to a painting no one knew how to trace. Naomi's team cataloged them all. Sometimes the stories found their names, sometimes they didn't, but all of them had a place. That was the promise. Not to fix the past, but to refuse its erasure. Naomi Carter never changed her name. She never needed to. Her mother had already given her one, and that name was now carved into the foundation of an institution that once tried to bury it. Whitmore would remain on the wall, but Carter would live in the light. And in the end, that light was enough to change everything.